Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we've got a really interesting show today for everyone because bereaved people are really struggling during this COVID time. And we have got a great guest to talk to us about that today, some of the issues that you may have when you're feeling bereaved and how you're going to deal with that anxiety and disappointment. I think there's a huge amount of disappointment, and disappointment's a deep word. People are disappointed about the way the end of life has happened and what they haven't been able to do. So Heidi, would you introduce our guest?
Sure, I'd love to. And our guest today has been on our Open to Hope cable show, so you can also watch him there. He is a major leader around the world in grief and loss, and his name is Dr. Dale Larson. And like you said, Mom, we are going to be talking about bereaved struggles during COVID-19. Dale is a professor at Santa Clara University, and he is the author of The Helper's Journey, Empathy, Compassion, and the Challenge of Caring. And he has written extensively in peer-reviewed journals as well as for the public and been interviewed about grief, loss, hope, and healing. So welcome to the show, Dale.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be with you again. I just so much admire what you're doing, and it's so important.
So much fun to have you on always. And fun is kind of an odd thing to say during COVID, but there is joy and wonder. But we're talking about a really tough subject right now. And Dale, it's dear to my heart right now because Heidi got COVID. And it was so scary for us, for my husband and I, to know we were apart from her and she had COVID. And also my sister-in-law's in a long-term care setting, and she is in hospice. And we get the saddest phone calls from her. And so leading up to this is breaking our hearts. I think we feel disappointed in ourselves that we can't do more, that we're not, and then having the loss happen. And I don't know, talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, you're just pointing to the key things that are happening, which is the separation, the isolation, the way all the normal ways that we cope with these situations are being interfered with. Not being able to be with our loved ones when they're struggling, the absolute anxiety that we have about what's going to occur. All the ways that we cope with these situations are being interfered with. So we are, I think disappointment is a good word, and sometimes that can become guilt, which becomes a problem. We can talk about that and how we might work with that because we feel bad we're not able to be there. You weren't able to be with Heidi, you weren't able to be with your relative in that situation, which we normally would do. We would normally be there and we'd have those conversations and we'd be able to process things. So there's a ton of unfinished business, we call it, that remain for us in all these situations. They're incomplete. I think also we have a lot of other things going on with anxiety in this crisis that are extraordinary, that are situational. So we're going to eventually have to learn how to undo some of these learned behaviors that we're taking on.
So talk about what's going on for the people that you're seeing where there has been a death and they're feeling guilt and there's not a funeral, and talk about some of those things that are happening.
Well, there's a terrible feeling. I can't be there. So many people are telling me, we've had a death in the family. And so it's not just COVID-related deaths, it's all deaths now. It's affecting everyone. The COVID is a subsample. COVID-related deaths and grief, it's a subsample, and it may be the most extreme. So think of it as, you're at the epicenter if you have a COVID-related loss, because the isolation, the separation is more extreme because of all the precautions that are taken, the limited travel. But you have it across the board. And so what we're seeing is that people are absolutely being torn, that we're not able to be there, to be at the funeral, to mourn the way we mourn. We can't sit Shiva. We can't do any of the things, if you're Jewish and they're just across the board. It's become so complicated. So I think, if you're right at the epicenter and, you have a COVID related loss and you're saying goodbye to your loved one on Facebook as you're standing outside the hospital or the ICU, what could be more traumatic than that? So I think the novel coronavirus is going to generate some novel forms of traumatic bereavement that we're going to be managing for those people who have a COVID-related loss. But again, it's going to be affecting all the losses that people are having during this period.
Well, and I read something where someone said, I feel like the loss is fake.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it really didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even though they're hearing that it happened, I think some people are wondering, is the person really gone?
Yeah, accepting the reality becomes really difficult when you are trying to do it in a virtual reality.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't seem real. It doesn't feel real. We have to be there holding people, talking to people, experiencing it more fully. So how can one experience it really fully? And that's the problem with grief. We have to confront it and be with it. And it's really hard when it's being done in this kind of virtual reality. So I haven't thought of this before, but kind of like virtual grief. It doesn't really it doesn't quite make sense, but it kind of does. We're having a different form of grieving, and what's the end going to be with this? This is getting complicated.
How are people going to get started again? We're opening the economy. How are people who are grieving going to get started again?
Well, there are a lot of steps with guilt in particular, that sometimes we are confusing guilt with regret, and that it's natural to feel regret in a lot of these situations, guilt in COVID-19. And, there are a lot of different forms it can take. Mm-hmm. You could have an experience where you're feeling like, she got it from me. I've actually contributed to this death because I might have infected him or her. That is a really tragic kind of thing to have to live with and to be uncertain about it forever. So that could be a very painful experience.
Well, and I'm gonna step in here, Dale, because
Sure.
I'm gonna tell you, as someone that had COVID-19 and was symptomatic for 3.5 weeks, my biggest concern was not for myself. It was, how many people have I unknowingly infected? Mm-hmm. And how many people am I now, like, I'm so afraid my family is now going to get infected. So like you said, I mean, the guilt and shame that goes around having COVID-19 is just beginning to be talked about out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very powerful, and it's the uncertainty. So it allows us to just kind of freely attribute, it to ourselves, which is a natural tendency to kind of blame ourselves in any situation, because we want to get some control. We want to, and that's a lot of what guilt is about. It's feeling like I can kind of have some control because someone's responsible, namely me, and actually that kind of doesn't work too well. Because we are, worsening our situation. Shame is even worse, if I might, talk a little bit about that, because shame is, I'm bad. If it goes to shame, it's even more problematic for us because we're feeling less good about ourselves. So, self-compassion has to kick in there pretty quickly. But with guilt, we want to move shame to guilt, actually. But then when we get to guilt, with this situation, there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't know if I'm responsible or I'm not responsible.
Right.
And one of the things that's good to do is to imagine, well, what would you say to someone else in your situation? So if I said to you, Heidi, well, what would you say? You're a therapist, and
right.
So it's a little different. But just in general, if you say to people, what would you say to someone else in your situation? They probably would say very comforting things, saying, you couldn't possibly know that. You didn't know you even had this condition, at that particular point in time. So it might relieve you some of the guilt and the self-blame, because there's responsibility and then there's blame, and we have to really differentiate between them.
Well, and it sounds like the same kind of thought process can be used for someone that is grieving a loss
Mhm,
and that is feeling, that is criticizing themselves for not being there
mhm.
and for not doing more as their loved one was dying.
Exactly, yeah. That when you step back from it and you realize, really the feeling that's there is more deep regret. There was really nothing I could do,
Hmm.
that I couldn't possibly be there. And then we have to experience, and this is the hard thing that sometimes we don't want to experience for good reason, which is the helplessness, the
Yeah.
powerlessness that we really had in that situation. And then we bump into that and it's very, very painful. So as long as we make, sometimes guilt has this kind of function in grief, and it can kind of, in a way, be a little bit of a barrier against experiencing the grief fully. And I think in this situation, there are just so many ways that we can be making all kinds of attributions, self-attributions, blaming ourselves, when there's really not a rational reason. So guilt doesn't have to be rational. That's one of the
Hmm.
key things about guilt, is it's not rational. But the thing about guilt is too, and shame also, is that there's an upside to them in a way, because they point to something. All our emotions have something to teach us. So even guilt and shame, they're pointing in a direction. They're saying, here's maybe what we need to do. We need to move toward repairing something if we can, which
Hmm.
in the COVID situation, a lot of times, what you're talking about, you can't really do anything different, have done anything differently, and you can't do anything differently in retrospect. But with the Monday morning quarterbacking, you can
Right.
say, well, what could I have done? Well, I really couldn't have done anything.
Hmm.
That sometimes can be a relief. But both of them kind of point toward, seeking to restore good feelings and connection, because they're very socially motivated kinds of feelings. So with guilt, we want to repair a relationship, but the problem is that when someone's died, maybe we have to do that in a counseling situation, or just internally talking it through with them. This unfinished business. There's so much unfinished business in this COVID world now. It's
Well, my
unbelievable.
mom and I always talk about Gestalt therapy
Yeah,
and like having maybe an empty chair in the room
yeah,
with if you're in therapy or by yourself, and have visualizing, your loved one there, and what would you say, like you said, having a conversation.
yeah. And your loved one could be saying things like, "I know you would have been there.
Hmm.
I know you would give anything to be with me. I know you'd almost give your life to be with me, and I know you couldn't be with me. I forgive you."
Hmm.
I think those are the kinds of inner voices we need to have kind of rise up, to support us. So, maybe you could call it self-compassion,
Mhm.
Yep.
really being kind to yourself. I think we feel so horrible, and I think a lot of that is deep, deep regret more than guilt. So I think that it's important to recognize that we have that, and we don't want it to become shame. We don't want it to become a feeling of like there's something really bad about me that I
Hmm.
didn't do this thing that I couldn't possibly do.
Peer support is tremendously helpful.
Oh, it's unbelievable. It's that instant empathy you can have in a group with people who have the same experience. And then we have the providers and their guilt. One of the major findings in end of life research was a huge study of end of life workers. And they said, what are your major stressors? Number one was the workload, which is understandable with, limited resources around. But the second most powerful stressor for them that they reported was not having the time to grieve. And if you think
Hmm.
about the frontline COVID people,
Yeah.
they don't have time to grieve.
Let's give people some ideas.
All of those things that would normally have happened have not happened yet, and we kind of put it on hold. When you put grief on hold, it gets frozen in a different way, and than what we like. And so it's going to take some real attention to following through, to making those things happen that would naturally have happened. I really believe that. I think that, and sometimes I've heard from some people, well, she didn't even want a funeral, so maybe we won't do anything. Well, she might not
Yeah,
have
I say
wanted
one
one.
thing there. I always say funerals are for the living. When I hear people tell me now they're going to do
Yeah.
that, they want this, they want that, they want this, and
Right.
I always say funerals are for the living.
But with the new challenges, it's easy to go with that kind of thought and
Hmm.
not push forward and make it happen, which you have to do for yourself and all the survivors. And we have to find ways to recreate things that would have normally happened
You
naturally.
got a couple of suggestions on recreating things?
Well, I think, the idea of, I mean, it's thinking about the future. How do we ever get together again? I think we're so uncertain about when we can meet, but I do think there's a lot of value in having, lots of Zooming and people
Hmm.
communicating. It's not as good as being in person, IRL, but it's very, very good. So reaching out, having the family members communicate with each other and really talk things through has a tremendous value. And actually, you can have a more extended conversation now with Zoom. Let's take advantage of this technology and really put it to work and have more meetings with everyone there. I think, as you know, and we all know, rituals are very important. So trying to build in some rituals, and as you're saying, Gloria, it's a long-term project, annual things. I mean, we know that grief goes on for life.
The Helper's Journey, Empathy, Compassion, and Challenge of Caring is out, the latest edition, and it's got some good stuff on there. It's got some things about burnout that you can give yourself a little test and all sorts of advice. And thank you so much for being on, Dale. You're fantastic.
Thanks, Let's. Well, it's really an honor, and I really just always cheer you guys on. You're just doing such tremendous work. So love you. Take care.
Visit us at opentohope.com. But also, we're excited to tell you we're going to have an International Day of Healing on June 22nd. And we hope you'll all join us. We're going to have a whole day of healing for you. It's going to be fabulous. It's going to be supported by the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation and the Soaring Spirits and TAPS Tragedy Assistance Program. It's going to be an absolutely amazing day for you all to get some help and love and coping. And God bless all of you that are out there that have had a loss. Our hearts are with you. It's a long-term process. Hang in there. And Heidi and I, and I'm sure Dale, want to remind everybody that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.